The heavy air of Washington hung over the city like a dense curtain of fog. The distant wail of sirens echoed through the streets, a forewarning of the storm that was about to unfold. Senator Pam Bondi gripped the file in her hands, steadying herself as she walked toward the courthouse. She had faced intense trials before, but today was different. Today, one of the most corrupt figures in the American justice system was about to be exposed. As soon as she stepped through the courtroom doors, she felt the weight of the moment. Every eye was on her. Journalists were lined up, eager to capture the best angles. Lobbyists and political figures sat quietly in the back, observing. But the most striking figure in the room was still seated at the bench, Judge Howard Gates. Howard Gates, one of the most feared names in Washington. From the judge's seat, he projected the image of a law-abiding man, a guardian of justice. But Bondi knew better. He wasn't a judge. He was a fixer, a man who safeguarded the interests of the powerful while keeping those who opposed them in check. Today, she was here to bring him down. But Gates didn't look remotely concerned. That signature smug smile remained firmly in place, as if he was still the one in control. Bondi approached her table, but before she could even take her seat, Gates lifted his head, barely glancing at the documents in front of him. His voice carried the same arrogance that had allowed him to rule unchecked for years. "Miss Bondi, I sincerely hope you won't be wasting my time today. Otherwise, I'd be happy to dismiss this nonsense and spare us all the unnecessary hassle." The words sent a ripple of tension through the courtroom. From the defense table, Charles Lawson's attorney smirked, sitting back like a man who already knew how this would end. Bondi narrowed her eyes, taking a slow, deliberate breath. This wasn't a typical case. If Gates was this confident, it meant he had something to protect. "Your Honor," Bondi said, her voice sharp but measured, "if I'm wasting anyone's time today, it's the time of those who have been stealing from the American people, and those who have been protecting them." Gates let out a low chuckle, tapping his fingers lazily against the bench. "The taxpayers, huh?" he mused, feigning amusement. "Miss Bondi, if you spent as much time in this city as I have, you'd understand that if we scrutinized every dollar, we'd never get anything done. But I suppose you wouldn't know that, would you?" Journalists' pens scratched against their notepads in unison. The energy in the room had shifted. This wasn't just a hearing anymore, it was a battle. Bondi exhaled slowly, keeping her composure. Then, with calm precision, she flipped open the file in her hands. "Then, allow me to ask you something, Your Honor," she said, her tone sharpening. "If this is such a trivial matter, why did Charles Lawson's company receive 3 times the approved government funding?" A murmur spread through the courtroom. The defense attorney shifted in his seat, and even a few jury members exchanged glances. The tension thickened, but Gates, he didn't blink. "Mr. Lawson is one of the most respected businessmen in this country," Gates replied, his voice colder now. "Be very careful who you accuse, Miss Bondi. It might cost you more than you think." And just like that, Bondi understood. This wasn't just about a corruption case. It was about something much bigger. Gates wasn't just defending Lawson. He was protecting an entire system, one that Bondi had just ripped a hole in. Her phone vibrated on the table. Without breaking eye contact with Gates, she glanced at the screen. A single message flashed across it. "If you don't stop, they'll stop you." Her grip on the file tightened. When she looked back up at Gates, she caught it, the faintest flicker of unease behind his eyes. Now she knew. This case wasn't just dangerous. It was a declaration of war. The courtroom had become a stage. The tension a thick fog that clung to the air. Muted whispers, wary glances, and the heavy silence of anticipation filled the space. Pam Bondi locked eyes with Judge Howard Gates, reading the cold calculation behind them. This wasn't a legal proceeding anymore, this was a battlefield. And across from her wasn't just a corrupt official, he was a man who had spent years hiding in the shadows of power, guarding a system that thrived on secrecy. At the defense table, Charles Lawson feigned indifference, leaning back in his chair as if nothing was wrong. But Bondi noticed his fingers tapping lightly against the desk, an unconscious rhythm of unease. He knew something was off. Gates, meanwhile, sat at the bench with an air of nonchalance, an illusion, Bondi realized. His shoulders weren't as squared as before, and the way he absent-mindedly twirled a pen in his hand was a giveaway. Bondi rose to her feet, methodically opening the file in her hands. She spoke clearly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Your Honor, I have in my possession a detailed report outlining the unlawful flow of funds into Mr. Lawson's company. Government-allocated funds were tripled in the final transactions. So my question is simple. How did that money end up in his accounts? What we have here is a blatant case of financial misconduct." Gates narrowed his eyes. "And what evidence do you have to support these accusations, Miss Bondi?" Pam allowed herself a small smile. There it was, the move she had been waiting for. She picked up a folder and handed it to the court clerk, who projected the contents onto the courtroom screen. "These documents show clear evidence of fraudulent transactions," Bondi said, pausing for effect. Then she met Gates's gaze. "And, Your Honor, every single one of these transactions has your signature on them." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, hurried scribbles from reporters, the shifting of jury members exchanging glances. It was chaos. But the biggest reaction of all was from Judge Gates himself. His eyes darted to the screen, locking onto the damning evidence. The room fell silent as he sat there, motionless, absorbing what had just been revealed. Then, slowly, he leaned back and exhaled, his expression unreadable. "These documents," he said, his voice eerily calm. "How were they obtained?" Bondi nearly laughed. There it was, his biggest mistake. He wasn't challenging the content of the evidence. He was challenging its origin. "Your Honor, these documents were obtained through legal means, pulled directly from official government records. They are right here in this courtroom for all to see." Her tone was razor sharp. Gates hesitated for just a moment before his gaze darkened. "Miss Bondi, I know how you operate. If these documents were truly legitimate, we wouldn't be having this discussion." Bondi didn't answer right away. Instead, she calmly turned to her briefcase, unzipped it, and pulled out a small voice recorder. The room, already tense, sank into absolute silence. She placed the recorder on the desk and pressed play. A voice filled the air. "This needs to be handled. They cannot get their hands on those records." The courtroom collectively froze. Everyone recognized that voice. Journalists scribbled furiously, attorneys stiffened, and the jurors shifted in their seats. It was Judge Howard Gates. At the defense table, Lawson's attorney sat in stunned silence. Lawson himself had gone completely pale, but the most dramatic reaction came from Gates. Slowly, he straightened in his chair, his skin now noticeably paler. There was still anger in his eyes, but something else too. Panic. This is absurd," he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual authority. Bondi leaned forward slightly, folding her hands together. "That recording, Your Honor, proves that you attempted to interfere with this case." Gates clenched his jaw. "That recording is inadmissible." Bondi tilted her head slightly, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. Illegally obtained evidence isn't permissible in court, right? But don't worry, Your Honor. This recording was obtained through a federal investigation, fully legal. The room was suffocating with anticipation. Bondi could feel it. The tide was shifting. She took a deep breath, then made her final move. She turned toward the back of the courtroom, locking eyes with the court officer. "I believe it's time to take action." The room seemed to hold its breath. The officer nodded and took a step forward. And then, loud and clear, the words rang out, "Judge Howard Gates, you are under arrest for falsifying official records, obstruction of justice, and financial misconduct." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, the sound of cameras clicking furiously, chaos. Gates didn't move. He sat there, frozen, as if unable to process what was happening. For the first time in his career, he was no longer the one in control. At the defense table, Lawson exchanged panicked whispers with his lawyer. He knew the tide had turned, and it had turned fast. But the truth was out. Pam Bondi knew this wasn't over. There were bigger players in this game. But one thing was certain. For Howard Gates, the game was over. The courtroom had transformed into a battlefield. Every breath was held, every eye locked onto the scene unfolding before them. The once dominant figure of Judge Howard Gates now sat hunched in his chair, his previously confident demeanor stripped away. The man who had ruled over this room just moments ago now looked like a captain watching his ship slowly sink beneath him. Pam Bondi didn't move. She didn't need to. She had already won. The only thing left was to watch Gates make his final move, one last desperate attempt to escape the inevitable. His voice wavered as he spoke. These so-called pieces of evidence, they must have been obtained illegally. This is inadmissible." Bondi narrowed her eyes. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "Are you really still focused on how the evidence was obtained? Or are you more concerned about what it reveals?" Gates inhaled sharply, gripping the edge of his bench. The panic seeping from beneath his skin was no longer subtle. It was palpable. Then, the doors to the courtroom swung open once more. Two uniformed officers stepped in, their heavy footsteps echoing against the polished floor. A ripple of movement spread through the crowd. Reporters lifted their cameras, jurors straightened in their seats, and defense attorneys shifted uncomfortably. One of the officers strode toward the bench, his voice steady and firm. "Howard Gates, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, bribery, falsification of official documents, and the misappropriation of public funds." A deafening silence followed. This was one of the biggest falls from grace in Washington's history. Gates didn't move. He sat frozen, as if clinging to some last shred of power, unable or unwilling to accept his fate. To a man like him, falling from the heights of power was no different from a death sentence. "Stand up," one of the officers ordered, his tone sharp and commanding. Gates looked as if he might protest, but then his shoulders sagged. He lowered his gaze to the floor and slowly, reluctantly, pushed himself to his feet. One of the officers reached for his cuffs, and in that moment something shifted in the room. Howard Gates, the man who had ruled from the bench, twisted laws in his favor, and dictated the fates of so many, was now bound by the very justice system he had manipulated for years. The sharp click of metal locking around his wrists sent a ripple of reactions through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed in rapid succession, and murmurs filled the air. Everyone present knew they were witnessing the end of an era. Bondi remained seated, watching as Gates was led from the courtroom. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. But she knew one thing, this wasn't the end. Gates was just one piece of the machine. Who had shielded him for so long? What higher forces had allowed him to operate unchecked? This was only the beginning. As Gates disappeared through the doors, Bondi turned to the jury, her voice unwavering. "This investigation is ongoing," she said firmly, "and rest assured, it won't stop here." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. But outside, in the marble hallways of Washington, whispers had already begun. Justice hadn't just come for Gates. There were bigger players still waiting in the shadows, and Pam Bondi was going to bring them all down, one by one.